Hello there, this is a tutorial for astoundinghost.com about cPanel server security. By default, cPanel has no interface in WHM for a firewall, and I really would recommend installing a software firewall. Even if you've got a hardware firewall, it still helps to have a software one as well, just as another layer of defense. Now, the best free firewall out there, in my opinion, would have to be CSF. Now, it's a free product, very well developed, and it's easy to use, I would say. I mean, you look at this and you don't think, oh, I don't know where to start, because it's just, well, it's laid out nicely. All the options are there, and it's fairly clear and easy to use. To install CSF, you need to use SSH. Or if you've got a server management company, you could ask them to do it, or your provider. But to install it, you want to go to SSH, and you want to run these 5 commands here, which will be in the description later on. Once you've completed those commands, if you then go to config server and firewall under plugins, CSF will load up. By default, it won't be enabled. It will be enabled, but it will be in testing mode. So I'll just put that in there just to demonstrate. So yeah, this is what it will look like by default when you've just installed it in test mode. Now, the first thing I would recommend you do is take it out of test mode, because while it's in there, it's not fully functioning. So to do that, go on the firewall configuration and change that to a 0. Have a read of that. It basically just says what testing mode does, but really in a live environment, testing mode doesn't need to be enabled, so just disable that. Okay, and once it's enabled, you've then got your firewall ready to go, and against basic attacks, CSF will kind of block them for you. It works pretty well, and it doesn't require much configuration. I mean, there are a lot of settings you can change. If I just go on here, I can show you there's lots of settings about ports and what you want to block, what you don't want to block. Yeah, there's a lot in there. But to start with, until you're confident with Linux and the firewall you're using, in this case CSF, I really wouldn't recommend changing those, just because you might do something that could block access to your VPS, or something that later on is going to cause problems. So if you do want to change something, then it's probably best to ask on the CSF forum, or your hosting provider, or whoever. Once you've got this running, I would recommend going on check server security, which will basically just give recommendations about what you should do to your server to improve the security. But these are only recommendations, so if you don't want to change them, you don't have to. But things that are being said in here are wise, and I would recommend doing them. Because it won't take long. I mean, it would take about 20 minutes to half an hour just to go through most of these, because most of them can be done in WHM itself. But make sure that you do a bit of research on what you're actually changing here, so that you don't end up causing any problems. But most cPanel servers will look pretty much the same as this on a default out-of-the-box installation. So if you're getting all these warnings, don't panic. It's not just you. You just need to do a bit of hardening yourself. So give that a go, see what happens, and then once you've done the security settings, just run it again, and it will give you a news score down the bottom here. And then just go and work on what you want to work on, really. Now, with CSF, the great thing about it is that you can actually block like firewall IPs from the web interface. So you don't need to go into SSH and run a command. You can just do it all from the web version here, and it's fairly straightforward. I mean, it's very nicely laid out. So Yeah. Also, I would recommend testing the IP tables, because a lot of people post on forums and ask questions about why a certain feature isn't working, or they might say that CSF is playing up, and that could be because of a module that your hosting provider has set, or a module that, if you're on a dedicated server, that you've set yourself that's not compatible with CSF, or that CSF doesn't like. So if you just go on test IP tables here, you can get a report on all the modules that are loaded, that need to be loaded, so that functions within CSF can work. Now, generally speaking, this report looks fine. I mean, it's reporting the XT connection limit is failing because that module isn't enabled, but most of the things on there are okay, and CSF will function correctly, dependent on your setup, because not everyone is going to have the same setup. So once you've done that, though, make sure to restart CSF. If there is anything on here that you need to have access to, then just go ahead and ask your provider to enable that module for you, or do it yourself, or whatever. But yeah, I mean, in the real world, it would be nice to have all of these showing as okay, so that you can use all the features that CSF has to offer and get the most out of it. But if you've got one or two that aren't working, don't necessarily worry about it. As long as CSF is still blocking IPs correctly and dealing with attacks, then that's fine. So just restart that when you're done. It should be good. I'm now going to be covering changing the SSH port. In this case with cpanel, config server, the CSF firewall, and I'm going to be using putty for this demonstration. So to start with, you want to go to open your SSH client and do nano, or whatever you want, or whatever text editor you want to use, etc sshd_config, and then you want to find port 22, which is the default, and you want to uncomment that and change it to the port of your choice. It doesn't really matter what port you choose, as long as it's not used by any other service. So once you've changed that, just save that, and then go into your firewall, so in this case CSF, and you want to search for 22 because that's the default SSH port, and replace that with the port that you've just set yourself. So let's add these in here. Right, I've now got, the firewall is now allowing the new port I've just set up. So change, and make sure to restart the firewall, and then restart SSH. You can do that from cpanel or in SSH itself. Just restart, it's restarted. Now I should get a message saying, yep, it's closed. So then if I go ahead and reconnect, and use the new port, yeah, that's worked. So it's been a bit slow. Just log into SSH from there. There we go. So that's worked. But yeah, it's not too hard, and it does have enormous benefits, because it means to say that if a hacker wants to try and target your server, then they might try and target it via SSH with the default port 22 and the standard username of root. So the only thing they've got to crack really is the password, which, you know, they could, if they know something about you, they might troll your interests, or they might try dictionary lists or something like that. So just changing the port makes their job a little harder. So yeah, I'd recommend doing that. I'm now going to be looking into some of the security features that WHM has built in by default, all of which can be done via WHM itself. So yeah, no SSH required, so just have a look at these. Firstly, I wanted to look at compiler access. Now, generally speaking, I never have this enabled on my cpanel servers, just because in my past experience I've never had to use a C compiler on the system, and I've never had anyone request access to it, and it seems to be the general trend on forums that people don't really need it unless they're using it for malicious purposes. So I would just go ahead and disable that, So yeah, just click on disable compilers and then it will be disabled. You can still give access to individual accounts if you want, but that's up to you. Next I'll go on to the security policies under Security Center and set a password age. Now generally I just leave it at the default, which is 90. So every 3 months people have to change their password. I would be happy doing that if I was the end user. So I think 90 days is reasonable. Anything less than that and people might just start getting a bit annoyed having to change their passwords too frequently, so 90 days is good enough. As for the password strength, again I would enable that, and then go ahead and set the actual password strength here. I always use anywhere from about 25 to 30, which will stop really basic passwords from being used. You know, don't go over the top and use 100 because no one will be able to remember what their password is once it's that high. So just, you know, keep it sensible so people can actually use a password that they can remember. So yeah, anywhere from 25 up to 40 or something is good, really. So just use that along there, go to where you want to be and save that. Limit logins to verified IPs. Generally speaking, I don't do this unless it's a server that only I'm using and I don't have other people using it, like clients or what have you. Then I don't enable that because it's just going to cause problems, I think. Because you're going to have to go into the you're going to have to allow people's individual IP addresses to access to cPanel, so I just wouldn't do that. So once you've done those settings there, save that. And now go on to brute force protection. Again, this is quite a handy feature. Just helps to combat against kind of just brute force them, really. I always have it enabled. It doesn't do any harm. The default settings I think are fine. The only one I would enable would be to send a notification when the person has got a brute force login detected on their account. But apart from that, it's pretty much fine. If you've got a static IP address, then I would say go ahead and add your IP address into the firewall so that you can't get blocked yourself. But yeah, I wouldn't bother if you've got a dynamic IP, otherwise, you know, you'll be doing it all the time. Next, host access control. Really, this is only a useful function if you've got a static IP address. Reason being is if you don't, then you're going to find problems on occasions where your IP address changes, and then you've got problems because you can't access whatever daemon you've locked down. So if you lock down SSH, for example, then you're not going to be able to get back in without coming back into cPanel and removing that filter. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend setting up these unless you've got a static IP address. But this is helpful because if you lock down, for example, SSH and WHM, and possibly cPanel if it's only using the server, then that cuts off quite a lot of different areas for potential users to come in and take control of your server. So yeah, those are some good tips to remember. Next, I think it's important that you look at the shell fork bomb protection. Now, if you haven't assigned anyone SSH or telnet access, then really there's not really much point in enabling this, because if you're the only one who uses SSH or shell, then it's not really worth it because you're not going to go and use up all the resources yourself on the server. But I mean, yeah, it's good practice to use it, even if you're the only one who uses SSH. But yeah, that one's entirely optional, really. This video was made for astoundinghost.com. Thanks very much for watching. If you've got any questions, feel free to comment on our video or open a ticket at astoundinghost.com/clients.